the last word.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I do strike the last word. And I do appreciate Mr. Caston's indulging my colleagues' questions. I have a few questions as well, if Mr. Caston would be kind enough to share his insight. We've had informal conversations about his legislation on the House floor, and I want to ask a few additional questions if he would indulge me. Let me start, Mr. Caston, with this conversation about disclosure rules and not differentiating between small cap, medium cap, and large cap companies. That's precisely what the Jobs Act did. It didn't exempt small cap companies from every disclosure, but it did provide graduated or differentiated disclosure requirements based on the size of the company and tailored those requirements based on size. That's part of the ecosystem of existing securities law and was in fact enacted as part of the Jobs Act, which was a capital formation bill, bipartisan, that many on your side of the aisle, Mr. Caston, applauded. My question to you is, do you regret enactment of the Jobs Act given the lack of uniformity that you seek in this disclosure bill?
Well, to your first question, it is always a pleasure to indulge you, Mr. Barr. Yeah. I think these are separate issues, and no, I don't regret. I mean, one of the things that I think folks don't appreciate enough with climate is that if I as a CEO say I'm going to divest my operations in a country that doesn't enforce our child labor laws, your auditor then goes in and says, okay, show me where you are accelerating the depreciation of assets, showing where you're moving capital. If, on the other hand, I as a CEO say I'm going to be net zero in 10 years, your auditor doesn't have any guidance. And that doesn't matter if you're a small company or a big company. It means that investors, who may be big investors or small investors, want to know that you are doing what you say they're going to do. And I think it's appropriate.
Well, if I could reclaim my time, I think you've made your position known that you want small companies to be burdened with these disclosures. But let me ask you about direct and indirect greenhouse gas emissions.
Public companies, to be clear.
Yeah, I understand, but there are smaller public companies too. I'd like for you to help me understand what counts as a direct greenhouse gas emission and what counts as an indirect greenhouse gas emission. In your bill's definition section for direct and indirect, it lists all indirect greenhouse gas emissions that are attributable to assets owned or managed, including assets that are partially owned or managed by the covered issuer. My question is that under this definition, would company-owned computers and printers that are not solar powered be included in this category? And would company-owned cars be included even if it's a Tesla or a Prius?
There's a rich discussion that's probably more than we have time for here between Scope 1, Scope 2, and Scope 3 emissions, but the basic idea is that direct emissions, Scope 1, you burn fossil fuel on your premises, you're responsible for that. Scope 2, you buy something that required fossil fuel to produce it. So maybe you buy nuclear power to fuel your Teslas, you buy coal to fuel your Teslas, you have a different impact there. Scope 3 emissions within what you purchase, and frankly, the international accounting rules are still struggling to come up with that. But the idea that our international partners are trying to come up with is that in the same way that companies' liabilities add up and the great balance sheet in the sky still balances, we need to have.
Well, I think we're getting to the workability. I think we're getting to the workability and the practicality of the legislation. And the question would be, would companies that rely on solar power or use electric vehicles be required to trace the climate change impact of battery cells in the solar panels or the source of energy that feeds into the electric grid? Isn't that an indirect potential emission?
So I think the question of exactly how to implement and how to do the carbon accounting is a job that's best left to the regulators, not us legislators. But you're quite right. You're quite right.
Delegate that to unaccountable, unelected bureaucrats at the SEC, and that would result in climate disclosures for solar panels or battery cells. That I think that does illustrate the admission of how broad-ranging the bill is. Finally, let me ask you one final question. With such an expansive definition of indirect greenhouse gas emissions, are you worried that companies will be more hesitant to pursue expanding or acquiring other companies? I mean, absent your bill's disclosures, expanding or acquiring another company might be a really strong financial move for the company, but they may choose not to pursue such an economically productive opportunity or go public just to avoid having to report these seemingly undesirable information in these disclosures.
Again, I don't see the tension. The rest of the international world is already going down this track.
Well,
would
I
like
see
to
the
work
tension.
leader.
I see the tension. I think these owners' disclosures are going to be a huge disincentive for acquisitions. But I yield back.